Good afternoon. It's really wonderful to see you all here. Welcome to the program today on the Uyghur crisis in China. I want to thank all of you for being here today, especially members of the community who braved LA traffic and UCLA parking to join us. So I am Asma Saeed. I'm the director of the Islamic Studies program here at UCLA and the primary organizing faculty member of this event. Before we begin, I want to just go over a few guidelines. I want to say a few words in introduction about the UCLA Islamic Studies program and a few words of thanks. So with respect to guidelines, for a variety of reasons, we are not allowing any photography or video recording of this event, with the caveat that we have a professional videographer who is recording the talks and just the people who are speaking here, but no pictures of any audience members are allowed. The video will be posted online at the event after the event, so you're welcome to share it. To go online to the UCLA Islamic Studies program website and to share it or to view it again. We would ask that you please turn off your cell phones. And finally, one last guideline is that rather than having a free-for-all Q&A session at the end, to make it more productive, we will do a moderated Q&A. So I have two of our students who will be handing out index cards, and you can just write your questions on the index cards and pass them up to the students who will organize them, and we will try to do this in the most efficient way possible to have a productive Q&A. So a few words now about the UCLA Islamic Studies program. It is actually one of the oldest graduate degree granting programs in the United States, or in North America, some would say. It was founded in 1957. And over the decades, it has developed and continued as a very vibrant and active focal point for research, teaching, and public programming at UCLA. We are extremely fortunate here to have some of the world's leading scholars in all different interdisciplinary fields: history, law, comparative literature, anthropology, sociology. We're also very blessed because we have a number of other resources, including one of the largest library collections devoted to Islamic and Middle East studies, and one of the largest Islamic manuscripts collections in North America. In the past decade or so, the Islamic Studies program has entered a new phase of development due to very strong administrative support and the hiring of several new faculty members who are all in their own ways in their respective fields, dedicated to the academic study of Islam and Muslims in global, historical, and contemporary contexts. And our growth has been very much fortified by community support, so that's another reason that I'm very, very happy to see so many members of the community here. Actually, it has been especially fortified by support from an organization known as the Muslim Reform Institute that was founded out of the vision of the late Maher Hathout. This panel and several other major events that we've hosted at UCLA over the past 5 years would absolutely not have been possible without the support of the UCLA Islamic Studies MRI Fund. It's external philanthropic support like this that enables our program to have events like this one and to connect with communities so that we are not just a sheltered, isolated academic program, that we can have meaningful exchange with the broader public. And we very much appreciate gifts like the ones that MRI has given us, and we hope to grow in this way and to continue to develop our programming. So if you have any questions about how you can support the Islamic Studies program as well as our upcoming programs, please feel free to speak to me or to Jeff King, who is the Associate Director of Development in the Humanities Division. Jeff was here. He was here a few minutes ago, and he'll be here, I'm sure, again. So in addition to MRI, I would like to thank the Center for Near Eastern Studies, the UCLA Promise Institute for Human Rights, and the UCLA's program in Central Asia for their co-sponsorship of the events. There are quite a lot of students who helped, especially Tim Garrett and Rimsha Saeed, and I would like to thank all the students who helped to pull this together. And last but not least, I would like to thank the Humanities Development Office, especially Jeff King and Uriel Castellanos for their help with all of the logistics of this event. So this is how we are going to structure our program. I'm going to invite Salama Mariati, a board member of MRI, to say a few words of welcome to you all. And after that, I will take a few minutes to provide a brief historical background and demographic overview and introduce the panelists. And then each panelist will speak for about 15 to 17 minutes, but I think I'll give them 15 to 20 minutes. And then we'll have time for a moderated Q&A. There is a reception afterwards down the hall, and I'm very happy to say that we are going to offer some Uyghur cuisine from one of our local businesses. I invite you to enjoy conversation, continue the Q&A, and enjoy good food after the panel. So, Salam, please.
Thank you, Professor Asma Saeed, and thank you for your leadership in this program. And we're very delighted to be a part of this endeavor, particularly this issue on the Uyghur Muslims, but also in general, the partnership that we've developed between community and academia. We believe that there needs to be not only the bridge, but the partnership to do more with the great ideas and the great resources here available at UCLA. And that is why MRI, the Muslim Reform Institute, which is working on moderate thinking and Islamic reform, is in that partnership with the UCLA Islamic Studies Department. I'm also very passionate about this topic. Since the founding of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom back in the early 90s, the topic of the Uyghur Muslims has been a priority. Unfortunately, due to mainly political and geopolitical factors, this topic is not on top of the agenda when it comes to human rights. It is spoken about. For example, Ambassador Sam Brownback does speak about it, does criticize countries for their violations on the Uyghur Muslims there, but there has been no real policy direction on this issue. There's been no sense of urgency by the United States government, nor by the United Nations Security Council to address this issue, partly and significantly because China obviously is a member, a permanent member there, and can veto any resolution. So you will not find any resolution on this issue. You find statements from Human Rights Councils, High Commission on Human Rights on this issue, but you would not find anything in terms of a UN resolution, to my knowledge at least. However, within the United States Congress, you should be aware, and I know I'm jumping ahead, and I'm sure our experts will drill down on these topics, but it's good for us to be aware of these points, and then repetition will help us remember it, so that when we speak to it, to our neighbors and to our schools and our community groups, they become aware of the situation, because it is a situation of genocide. It's a situation of oppression, and it's a situation of using counterterrorism policy to oppress people. And I think these are very significant issues. But there are two resolutions in the United States Congress right now, mainly engineered by Congressman Christopher Smith out of New Jersey. And that resolution number is HR 7123. We should remember that, as well as a companion resolution on the Senate side, which is Senate Resolution S3622. But it criticizes China's campaign since 2014 of the Strike Hard Against Violent Extremism campaign. And it says within the congressional resolution that it has become Orwellian, in the sense that there's been an arbitrary collection of biodata, including DNA samples from children, without knowledge or consent. They track also how many times you pray on your cell phone. There is predictive policing databases through facial and voice recognition. There are countless checkpoints, and there's a sense by the Chinese government to eradicate tumors and kill weeds through this kind of so-called political re-education that we will hear about. What really astonishes us the most, however, as Muslims, is to see how Muslim-majority countries have applauded the Chinese government for this practice. And for those who claim to be working in the name of Islam, shame on them. And we should speak out vociferously against those countries, not only in terms of their exploitation to get whatever favors, economic, political, in that regard, but also to shame the name of Islam by calling themselves Muslim countries. And yet they're doing the one thing that violates the very essence of Islam, which is to bring human dignity to humanity. So with that, I just wanted to, again, reiterate how proud we are to be in partnership with Professor Esma Saeed and UCLA, and we hope that this can bring about some very positive action, and we'd be happy to continue on this path. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Salam, for those comments. And so let us get the program and its substance started. Now, as you just heard, and you probably know, the Uyghur crisis is one of the most urgent and yet neglected human rights crises of our times. Features of this state-financed humanitarian disaster have been very well documented by independent news outlets as well as reports from human rights groups. And they include what is on this list as well as things that are not on this list. There is the mass incarceration of a minority population in detention centers without cause or due process. The estimate is there are more than 1 million Uyghurs and other Muslims in detention centers at this point. There is state-sponsored physical and psychological torture, family separation, targeted arrests, and indefinite detention of leadership of this community, the banning of cultural symbols and practices. There's a suppression of and eventual or aimed at the eventual eradication of the Uyghur language. There is the seizure and destruction of sites such as shrines, cemeteries, and mosques, which are sacred to this population. And of course, there is the banning of all domestic dissent, and just as alarming is the surveillance, intimidation, and coercion of a diasporic global population. So most Uyghur studies scholars and the Uyghur community have characterized what's happening as a cultural genocide. And given the systematic process through which Uyghur forms of knowledge and life are being eliminated, I believe that this label is perfectly appropriate. So our guest speakers are going to cover these topics in much more detail, and my task really is just to make sure we're all on the same page with respect to some basic historical and demographic background. So starting first with history, I'm a historian. I go all the way back. And all the way back here means actually to the late 7th century. Muslims and Islam have been a part of the landscape of China since that time. There were Muslim explorers, scholars, traders, armies, mystics, who traveled across very well-known, well-established land and maritime routes, including the famed Old Silk Road, and they settled in areas that are now governed by China. There was, of course, conversion, natural population growth, and all of these account for the fact that over the past 13 centuries or so, there have been significant populations of Muslims in this expansive territory. So through them, Islam really has become, again, over a period of centuries, a part of the religious, social, cultural, and even architectural fabric of China. It is now one of the largest minority religions in China, and the Uyghurs are among the most numerically significant of these Muslim ethnic minorities. So who are they? The term is one, I believe, of more recent vintage, but they can correct me on that. And for me, recent goes back to a few centuries. It refers to a Central Asian Turkic ethnic group, and as such, they are culturally and in many other ways closer to their Turkic neighbors, such as the Uzbeks, than they are to the majority Han Chinese group. Their language is related to Turkish. It's traditionally written in the Perso-Arabic script, And as a population, currently the Uyghurs number close to 11.75 million. The vast majority of them are Muslims, and they live in a region known, or many of them, I should say, live in a region known as Xinjiang, which is actually the preferred Chinese government name for this territory. This region of Xinjiang has been controlled by the Chinese state, whoever happens to be the Chinese state, since the late 18th century. It is also called East Turkestan, especially by those who hope for greater indigenous autonomy. So over a course of, let's say, 2 centuries or so, the local population has, to varying degrees, nurtured hopes for greater political independence, has struggled with some success to preserve their language, their religion, and their local customs in spite of the hegemonizing influence of the Chinese state. The precise trigger for the crisis that is the subject of the panel today really is subject to dispute. There have been restrictions on the ethnic minorities, all of them, Muslims, different ethnic minorities, that have been tightening over the course of years or decades. But it really is in 2016, 2017, when the campaign to suppress dissent underwent a dramatic shift. And here, when I'm talking about dissent, I am not just talking about sort of very overt forms of political dissent. I'm also talking about dissent as in cultural expression or religious expression, such as wearing a beard or a hijab or speaking the Turkish language. These are all counted as forms of dissent in China at this point. Under the regional party secretary, Chen Guangguo, who was appointed as minister of Xinjiang in 2016, the campaign really has become unprecedented in its scale, its pervasiveness, and its ruthless efficiency. The Chinese government's official stance on this crisis is that they are implementing a policy of re-education and vocational training to deal with an internal threat to head off potential uprising by properly integrating a recalcitrant population. The implementation of this policy coincides with China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is also known as the New Silk Road Initiative. This is a map of just the broader overland and maritime routes that China is looking to develop as part of this infrastructure project. And as you can see from this map, Xinjiang sits squarely along the New Silk Road route. And I think it's no coincidence that the pacification of Xinjiang's population is accelerating as this infrastructure project is being carried out. And a final substantive point that I want to make is that Uyghurs are not the only Muslims in China. This is a map of all of the major religions of China, and I've listed some other Muslim ethnic minorities here. So earlier, the Chinese state had adopted a slightly different policy towards other ethnic minorities, in particular the Hui, and there was more of a process of acculturation going on with the Hui. But currently, Muslims of all ethnic backgrounds are being targeted by this policy that we think was once directed primarily at the Uyghurs. I want to conclude my comments by emphasizing that it really is a mistake to think about this as a crisis confined to Xinjiang. It is, in all respects, a global crisis. Its effects are, first and foremost, being felt by Uyghurs and Chinese Muslims in diaspora. They have fled their homes, they have tried to reconstruct their lives in exile, and they are continually bonded to the suffering of those left behind. It's also global in the alarming ways, I would say, in which it relies on, it reproduces, and it amplifies global Islamophobic narratives of Muslims as the eternal internal enemy and Islam as the root of all radicalism and terrorism. And finally, it's a global crisis because each one of us is embedded in this global economy. And we are all connected to China's trade, cultural, and economic networks. So even as we are horrified witnesses to what's going on, we are also ultimately, each one of us, possibly the ones to benefit from China's economic development. And I think equally sobering is the fact that these technologies that China is developing in conjunction with this Uyghur project, they are being, these policies towards the Uyghurs, they are going to be exported to surveil and suppress dissent in other countries by leaders who are trying to do the same with their dissenting populations. So for all these reasons and more, I am very thankful to our panelists for sharing their expertise and helping us to understand this crisis in a more nuanced way. So I will begin then with an introduction to Nuri Turkel, who will speak first. And then I will do each one of the other introductions in turn. Nuri Turkel is an attorney in Washington, D.C. He specializes in regulatory compliance. And in addition to his law practice, he serves as the chair of the board for the Uyghur Human Rights Project. It is a documentation-based advocacy organization that he co-founded in 2004, and he served as the executive director until 2006. He has also served as president of the Uyghur American Association from 2004 to 2006. He's testified before the U.S. Congress, given presentations at universities, government institutions, and foreign policy forums in the U.S. and internationally. He's published in a number of outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, Foreign Policy, and appeared on a number of leading media programs, CNN, BBC, Fox News, Al Jazeera, and many others. He was born and raised in Kashgar. He received a bachelor's degree from Northwest A&F University in Xi'an, is it China? He has a master's in international relations and a JD from American University. Please join me in welcoming Nuri Turkel.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for organizing this event, Professor Said. On behalf of the Uyghur Americans, I'm grateful that this prestigious university is organizing this event to allow us to discuss one of the world's most horrifying crises unfolding and that entered its third year. In the meantime, I'd like to extend my appreciation to my co-panelists who have spoken in different events and learned from over the years, particularly to Darren for widely read piece on the foreign policy, right? The child separation policies and the homestay the Chinese government is implementing in addition to the concentration camps that they set up. At the same time, I'd like to extend my appreciation to my Uyghur friends here. I used to call California home before I moved to DC for law school education about 18 years ago. I'm glad to be back here. Since Professor Said already set the tone with the background information, I'm going to just dive into some of the key questions. That includes how did we get here? What is happening? Why it's happening? And what is the end game for the Chinese government, and what should we do about it? So the Uyghurs have been treated as subhuman by the Chinese government since its occupation of Uyghurs' homeland, East Turkestan, in 1949, with the help of Stalin's Soviet Union. Over the period of 60s, 70s, and 80s, Uyghurs have experienced various types of political repression, including the Cultural Revolution that you all know. And in the 80s, with the restoration of Uyghurs' cultural rights, the Uyghur people were allowed to exercise some of the social freedom, cultural freedom, including to set up some museums, and reorganizing particularly cultural heritage. And also the Uyghur language was promoted as I grew up as a Uyghur kid in my ancestral hometown, Kashgar. But since the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 90s, Chinese government took a big policy shift with the concern that the Uyghurs may inspire to demand political independency. They tried to prevent the Uyghur homeland from becoming another Balkan. So that takes us to 9/11. This is the most relevant, it's kind of old topic in America, but it's still a relevant topic in Chinese government officials' mindset and the way that they're formulating national security policies. So let's just talk about this. 9/11. 9/11, before 9/11, the Chinese government did not even use the term terrorism. Just 2 weeks, approximately 2 weeks before the 9/11 attacks in the United States, Chinese Communist Party held a press conference stating that Xinjiang is safe, a place for investment, people should come and invest. And soon after 9/11, they changed their position in its entirety, claiming that China is also a victim of global terrorism. We'll get to some of the specifics being reported in the New York Times today, but for the purposes of today's discussion, I need to point out that Chinese government's security policies is not based on the actual presence of security threat. It's rather their perception of certain threats, largely in their mindset, comes from the Uyghurs' ethno-national identity. When you look at the policy initiatives and implementation, you will see, especially today's revelation on New York Times, that they have a problem with the Uyghurs being Uyghur. And then there's another turning event for us to get today's crisis, is the July 5, 2009 Urumqi unrest that started as a peaceful demonstration, much like what is happening in Hong Kong. Because of Chinese government's brutal crackdown, it turned into a clash, ethnic clash, that resulted in many deaths. Oftentimes when you flip through the papers, the Western media cites 197 deaths, about 2,000 injuries. That is literally what the Chinese government says, without anyone being able to investigate to come up with a realistic figure. And then after this July 5 unrest, the Chinese government already tried to beef up its security presence, and securitization policy has been in process. That was already in a kind of a political environment that Uyghurs likened to an open-air prison. And then this takes us to 2012-14 period, which is very significant and important time period for us to keep in mind. During the period of 2012 and 15, there's some terrorist attacks that the Chinese government's called and some of the people acknowledges as violent incidents took place. And that gave Chinese authorities an excuse to come up with this policy called the de-extremification measure that have been in practice since early 2017. And also there's something else happened, which is also detailed in today's New York Times piece, that Xi Jinping went to Uyghurs' homeland in 2014, and he appeared to be dumbfounded that the Uyghurs are still living as Uyghurs. There's a quote by him that the Uyghur individuals followed him, heard, and he was surprised that the Uyghurs have not been assimilated. And then also around that time, and post-visit public statements, if you read an article, a scholarly article written by James Label, published last year, it has a timeline of how it's transformed from originally stick and carrot policy to stick only policy. Initially, the Chinese officials thought that improving the living standard, economic condition, that the Uyghurs will be fully subjugated. And then Xi Jinping's trip in 2014 gave him another reason, which was promoted by some of his policy advisors, that providing carrot is not enough. Therefore, they have to focus on the so-called thought viruses that the Chinese government had been publicly saying, such as, we try to transform the Uyghurs into normal human beings. So the thinking that the Uyghurs maintain as far as their national identity, cultural identity, political beliefs, if you will, treated as, or perceived by the Chinese government as a thought viruses. And today's New York Times article should be something that we can highlight. The New York Times reported today, after being able to obtain over 400 pages long document, which has kind of tell us actually, it was personally a relief for me because this report verifies much of the stuff that myself and other Uyghur experts have been saying in public, such as Xi Jinping's direct involvement and China's genocidal policies and their ultimate end goal to destroy Uyghurs' centuries-old ethno-national identities. And some of the language that they use, it's quite chilling. If you look at the actual, I invite you to visit New York Times website and dig through, and you will see some of the most jarring statements that the Chinese government officials use, including, like dictator-like approach to the issue. So sometime when you talk about Chinese government officials' mindset, they try to normalize it as if that they are another normal government. If you look at the thought process, surveillance and control of the Uyghurs, and then the complete control of the Uyghurs' social and personal lives is some of the measures that they implemented ever since. So what is this document? These documents reveal? They reveal several key issues. One, Xi Jinping is actually the individual, the Chinese leader, ordered today's concentration camp setup, management, and with ultimate genocidal policy objectives. Early on, when this camp situation came to an existence, revered legal scholar Jerry Cohen said jokingly in a public event that the Uyghurs, the international community should look at Xi Jinping, not Chen Quanguo. And people think that he's crazy, and even publicly said that the United States government should consider imposing a global Magnitsky Act on Xi Jinping, not on the other enforcers in the Chinese government. So he has proven to be right, that based on these over 400 documents, post-2014 Xi Jinping speeches, and policy initiatives, that it has actually been formulated in Beijing and being implemented with the exportation of that policy to another Chinese leader has been shown in Professor Said's slide. His name is Chen Quanguo. This is the individual. Some people describe him as a Chinese Adolf Eichmann, who has promoted this brutal policies. I think some of you know who that person is. Some of his specifically targeted policies include separating Uyghur children from their parents, and also forcing Uyghur women to marry Chinese individuals. As you may know, that there are about 30,000 Chinese bachelors, and the government is providing incentives for those Chinese individuals to go to the Uyghur region to marry Uyghur ladies. So when you look at the Chinese government's policies in this particular issue, it's worth to look at what communism, the Communist Party, really stands for. The Václav Havel during the Cold War and post-Cold War era pointed out that Communist Party is all about transformation. When you look at the official policy statements, including the one by Chinese ambassador to Washington, Sui Kang-kai, and others, they are trying to transform the Uyghurs through this human re-engineering projects to quote-unquote normal human beings. In other words, Uyghur being Uyghur in of itself is a sign of disloyal to the party and a sign of a potential political threat to the existence of the Communist Party. So this has been widely discussed, as you have noticed in Secretary Pompeo's recent speech, that largely focused on the source of the problem being the CCP's fear, sense of insecurity, as well as the leadership in the party. So transformation centers, transforming the Uyghurs is the common terminology that they have been using, including this Chinese official got promoted for the type of work that he did in Tibet before he got his current gig in August 2016. Professor Said mentioned the geographical significance. The Chinese government, in addition to stating that they have been engaging in these policies for security purposes, they have also geopolitical purpose. When you look at the map of the Uyghurs' homeland, it shows how significant it is for the Chinese government to realize or be able to achieve their ultimate goal in this Belt and Road Initiative that goes to over 70 countries. So let's move on to the camp situation. So the Chinese government initially started to set up different type of camps even before 2017. Today's revelation shows that this camp structure, or construction, and policy initiatives were in existence before Xinjiang was moved to Urumqi from Lhasa. So what kind of camps that we're talking about? In the media, you oftentimes just read concentration camps, internment camps, or re-education camps. Based on the scholarly research, based on media reports, based on survivors' account, we have been told that there are 4 types of camps exist today. The first one is the daily re-education that is set up in various government entities, schools, universities, and the other government state-owned enterprises. So what they do is they come up with a list of people based on their past writings, past social engagements, family connections, foreign travel, to send them to daily re-education. I don't want to name names, but I know several Uyghur Americans whose family have spent time up to 6 months, despite their age, despite their language skills, despite their education, despite their service to the country for more than 30 years. So that's the first type of camp. They call it re-education, daily re-education. And the second type is mostly discussed. That's the real concentration camp. Actually, that's where the most problem is. Based on artificial intelligence reported in Frontline the other day, the Chinese come up with a large database. So based on that database, they picked up people or sometimes asked people to show up. So UN last August properly labeled this as no rights zone. There's no access to lawyers, no access to courts, no access to family, no access to nothing. It's no rights zone established by the Chinese government. So when you look at Adrian Zen's 1.5 million recently be adjusted, I think it goes to this number. And then the third type is the actual prison. When you look at these 4 types of setups, some people even prefer prison over the camps. Mihrigul Tursun, who was testified in Congress, told us that because the condition is so horrible, there's no end in sight, crowded living, poor hygiene, poor diet, people usually, the physical collapse, and all types of illness, the mysterious drugs given to Uyghur women to control their emotion, the mysterious drugs given to control their monthly menstruals, and the reproduction rights. And also public, this was also reported recently in The Guardian, that Uyghur women and men have been subject to public sexual humiliations. That is where this internment camp, that's where the internment camps is where these incidents takes place in a regular basis. The third one is a prison. We know the Uyghur Human Rights Project profiled over 400 people. Most of them are Uyghur scholars, thought leaders, custodian of Uyghur cultural heritage, and one of the most famous one being largely discussed, including recent LA Times article, is Dr. Tashpolat Deep. I have some Uyghur friends here who know him in person and studied and worked with him. He was imposed death penalty with 2 years reprieve, along with other high-profile Uyghur community leaders and scholars. And recently we heard a disturbing news that his execution could be imminent. That's why that the media coverage in Congress and other places have been raising his case. And then the last one, this is also most relevant, it's labor camps. As you may know, that 84% of the cotton products produced in China or imported from China sourced in East Turkestan. It's a large cotton base. I recently testified in Congress on this particular issue, and the research based on the Chinese government official documents show that in order to to turn this into a political economy, Chinese government is setting up this forced labor camps. The Australian target, Cotton One, and the Hetian-Teida that exports cotton products to the United States, some of them even made to the shelves in the Costco store. That includes baby pajamas. The United States government has taken some actions to address that. So there are 4 types of camps that I'd like you to particularly pay attention to the labor, this last one that you may have seen on BBC and other media, that Uyghur individuals singing and showing a happy face, Potemkin villages. So those are the camps very similar to the labor camps that have been widely covered in the media. I would be surprised one of these days that you will be identifying additional or learn about additional companies. Recently, 2 Japanese companies, Uniqlo and one other company, have been implicated. So the business community had to be mindful, and some individuals in the government and business communities suggested that due diligence must be applied and can be implemented in order to prevent tainted products making to the shelves in the United States. But if somebody could not even say she or he is Muslim, or cannot even greet in Islamic fashion, what on earth that person would be able to tell what kind of labor condition, what kind of employment situation that person is. So due diligence is impossible. We might be seeing more about this executive and legislative actions. And I'd like to fast more forward to, Darren is going to cover some of this stuff. So I'm going to focus on 2 minutes, in my last 2 minutes, to talk about what is happening in Washington. Unlike some of the governments in Europe in particular that have survived or experienced fascism and Nazi Germany, United States government, you may have a different view towards Trump administration, but they have been some senior government officials, including Mike Pence and Pompeo and others, have taken a leadership role in this. Just in September, United States government organized a side event on the occasion of the General Assembly. I attended 2 of them, even participated in the press conference. There's a sense of urgency in Washington these days, as pointed out by Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia Pacific recently, that United States government had decided to raise the temperature because the quiet diplomacy, bilateral relationship did not really yield. And this also brings us to another point, interesting point that happened last month, is the entity list. Some of you may be familiar that the United States government add business entities to Commerce Department's list based on the national security concern. But this is the first time that the United States government imposed sanctions on business entities based on human rights concern. So these 28 entities, interestingly enough, includes the entire police department in the region, about 18, adding the construction corps. On top of that, the administration imposed a visa restriction to Chinese officials who have been responsible for human rights abuses committed against the Uyghur people. That list, as the individuals sanctioned, have not been announced, I think for strategic purposes, because that list is in the process of being expanded, so as the entity list. And also the United States Congress has been also very active. There are actually 2 legislation currently being discussed. We may have a bill, we've been saying this almost 2 years now, but we may have a bill sometime early next year that addresses some of the abuses committed against the Uyghur people. The State Department in particular, Secretary Pompeo, have been speaking out on a regular basis. Most recently, he came out in defense of Uyghur Americans like myself. I can guarantee you, if there was no concern about Chinese being able to identify participants even in this kind of event, we may have seen more Uyghurs showing up. Because I do public speaking quite often. Some events really have no Uyghurs in attendance, because Chinese government has been very effective doing multiple things. One, as you have heard, set up this surveillance police state, and then 2, creating anxiety by releasing crying Uyghur babies, Uyghur women being married out to the Chinese, trying to provoke the Uyghurs around the world to do something bad. And then the third, the Chinese oppression reaching to our shores, in our lives, in Western societies. They call people not to speak out. They pressure people to spy on the other Uyghurs and report to the Chinese. If they fail to do that, their family members will be taken away. So I wish I have a little bit more time to cover all of those issues, but I'll be happy to address some of your concerns, questions during the Q&A. But thank you again for the opportunity. I really appreciate to be able to speak to you about what has happened to my people.
Thank you very much, Nuri. And I have to say that I think I have the least favorite job in all of this, which is the minder of time. I am sure that we will have time later on to ask questions, and I'll allow each one of them to speak further. So our next speaker is Darren Byler. Darren Byler received his PhD from the Department of Anthropology at the University of Washington in 2018. His research focuses on Uyghur dispossession, culture work, and the securitization in the city of Urumqi, the capital of Xinjiang. He has published articles in the journals Contemporary Islam, Central Asian Survey, and the Journal of Chinese Contemporary Art. He's contributed essays to volumes on ethnography of Islam in China, transnational Chinese cinema, and travel and representation. He also writes and curates the digital humanities, art, and politics repository called The Art of Life in Chinese Central Asia, and I especially invite you to visit that website. It is an amazing repository of cultural artifacts and cultural production. So please join me in welcoming Darren Byler. Thank you.
Well, it's a real honor to be here. Thank you so much for organizing this and for all of you for coming. I'm going to talk a bit about sort of the economic drivers behind what's happening in this space, as well as the political drivers, and sort of walk through my fieldwork, which happened in northwest China in the city of Urumqi. I lived there for 2 years studying Uyghur and Chinese, and hanging out with people, doing fieldwork, because I'm an ethnographer. So there's many ways into this story, but one way to start is to think about the mass migration of Han folks, which is a majority group in China, to the Uyghur region in the 1990s and 2000s. There had been a presence of Han people in this region before, but in the 90s is when China was opening up to the West. Market economy was beginning to boom, especially in places like Shenzhen, close to Hong Kong. It was when China was becoming the manufacturer for the world. And to fuel that economy, they needed natural resources like oil and natural gas. And significant reserves of those things are in the Uyghur region. So in the 90s, we saw large populations of people moving to the West. And when they arrived, they began to open up the West. That was the name of the initiative, which meant that they were developing the hard infrastructure, the roads, the railroads, the pipelines to extract the natural resources from this space. And so that's what we saw developed in the 90s. 1995 is when the railroad reached Kashgar for the first time. And that brought with it many, many people from the eastern part of the country, Han people, that were working in those industries. It was almost exclusively the domain of Han people. Uyghurs were really not given jobs in these new economies. They also began to develop industrial scale agriculture in the Uyghur space, particularly around cotton and tomatoes. And so now around a third of the world's cotton is grown in this region and 25% of the world's tomatoes. So it's in your ketchup and your pasta sauce. So when they arrived at all of this infrastructure change really began to change the standards of living for people in some ways. The cost of living in particular began to rise. And so Uyghurs saw themselves becoming more desperate, needing to find a new way of entering into the market economy. And this wasn't offered through these new industries, and so they needed to move to find work. There's also lots of tension between land being taken from Uyghurs for infrastructure building and agriculture. One of the things that developed along with this hard infrastructure was softer forms of infrastructure, which was, in 2010, 3G networks. And so for the first time, Uyghurs were able to get online in their home villages because there was 3G wireless connections. And so when I began my first year of fieldwork in 2011, everyone was buying a smartphone, especially the young people. These were quite affordable Huawei phones, the ones that were made in China. People could get these, and they could put money on a phone card and they could get online. In 2011 and 12, a new app called WeChat also came online. The social media apps that we use here in the West were blocked in 2009 after the violence that Nuri mentioned. They were blocked throughout the country, but WeChat, which was from a company called Tencent, a Chinese company, allowed people to connect on social media. And the advantage of WeChat is that it's like WhatsApp, if you know what that app is. It allows people to communicate using oral communication, so you can just simply record a message. And since Uyghurs had varying degrees of computer literacy, and also the keyboard wasn't set up for Uyghur script, many people use that oral speech function. And it was really novel for them because they could connect with people far abroad, both within the Chinese state and within the Uyghur region, but also in Turkey and in Egypt, other places. Mostly they were interested in news. This was the time of the Arab Spring, so they were interested in that. But they were also interested in Islam because prior to 3G networks, they didn't have access to Islamic teaching that wasn't filtered by the Chinese state, especially on those oral speech networks. And so many people began to listen to tabligh, teachings by Islamic teachers, both in China and in places like Turkey. Mostly they're interested in forms of Hanafi, Sunni Islam, very standard forms of Islam. They just wanted to know, what is halal, what is haram, how should we live our lives, what does it mean to be a contemporary Muslim, those sort of questions. The WeChat also brought people to the city in different ways, because they could plug right into social networks using their social media. So when they arrived in the city, they could find jobs, and they could also find mosque communities. And so in 2014, when I did a second year of fieldwork, I would spend a lot of time in mosque communities, hanging out with the people that were going to mosque. They talked about the mosque space as a space for ritual practice for Islam, but not the space of what they called real Islam. And that has to do with the forms of censorship that happen in the mosque. There's cameras everywhere. The imams are trained and censored by the state. So many people learned about Islam from their phones and in prayer rooms that were in kind of underground prayer rooms that were in restaurants that were in that mosque community. So I spent a lot of time in those prayer rooms hanging out with people. These are illegal spaces, but were somewhat permitted at that time. This is pre-2014. That began to change in May of 2014, which was after there was a series of violent incidents. First one in Beijing with a truck driving into a crowd of people driven by a Uyghur family, a man and his pregnant wife and his mother. And then there was another incident in Kunming on March 1st, which is it's a city in eastern China, not in or southwest China, but not in the Uyghur region. 31 people were killed and others injured. And then there were some attacks, one of them while Xi Jinping was in Urumqi city. Trucks driving into a crowd of people, again, and a bomb that exploded in the train station. The bomb didn't kill people other than the people that were carrying the bomb. But in any case, the state began to think that they had organized insurgency that was really beginning to pick up, and they felt a really sense of threat. And they were feeling this from the Chinese public as well, because in places like Kunming, where Han people were killed, many people were now terrified of Uyghurs. And there had already been forms of ethno-racism towards Uyghurs for decades, but it really came to a head. So in May 2014, they declared the People's War on Terror, and that meant that they were going to track down these people that were carrying out violence. But it also meant something more. They began to conflate religious practice itself, piousness, with violence. They said that extremism is basically a sign of pre-terrorism or pre-criminality. And those people that hadn't carried out any sort of violent act yet needed to be retrained. They needed to be detained and re-engineered. And so in the neighborhoods where I was hanging out in 2014, these are the posters that began to appear. Posters that are banning Islamic appearance, pious practice in public, men no longer allowed to have beards, women no longer allowed to veil themselves, and no Islamic symbols on their clothing. And already in 2014, we began to see people disappear, being sent to camps that were being kind of set up in an ad hoc fashion. They were just high schools that were converted into camps. The People's War on Terror, though, began to take on a life of its own. It's really pulling on the global war on terror discourse. Nuri already mentioned some of this. Began in 2001, but really the state hadn't declared a war on terror until 2014. In this case, though, the terrorists are not far away. They're right in the country where the war is happening. And it's a minority Muslim population, and it's a minority Muslim population that makes capitalist expansion, development more difficult. The Belt and Road, which is Xi Jinping's major initiative, makes that more difficult. And it uses different tools than war on terror in other spaces. So it's not US drones and targeted killing or occupations of places like Iraq and Afghanistan, but instead it's a security industrial complex that uses camera systems, camps, and coerced labor. It's utilizing a new sequence in racialization. So it's racializing Uyghurs, saying all Uyghurs, because of how they appear, the language they speak, and the religion they practice, are a potential threat and should be seen as in a separate category from the rest of the country. And it's utilizing that racialization to dispossess them of their land and of their rights as citizens. And it's doing this in order to harvest data from them and also to use their labor. It's using the pretext of terrorism, as has already been mentioned, to enable a state of exception so that the normal rules don't apply. We can act with impunity towards this group of people. And this is similar to kind of disaster capitalism that happens in other spaces. It's producing two interlinked modes of production. One of them is it's taking data from people and to develop new forms of technology, surveillance tools. But it's also now beginning to use Uyghur labor to carry the economy. And I'll explain what that means as I move through the talk. So there's these predictive policing products that are being produced both from biometric data and from digital data that's taken from people's smartphones, from their social media history, and also producing new forms of coercive labor. And so in some ways we can see similarities to colonization in other spaces. Okay, so who are the actors in this security complex? It's state security, which is police and army, but it's also higher education. There's many research institutes across the country that have counterterrorism majors and journals that focus on this. There's a lot of funding for it. And then there's lots of private industry. Lots of the tech companies, basically all of the major tech companies in China are involved to some extent in Uyghur re-education. The goals of this complex was, at least initially, to break the autonomy of the Uyghur internet. Remember I said they were using WeChat, and the oral speech function. The reason they were able to do that was because the state wasn't able to fully control or censor Uyghur speech. They just didn't have the capability. And so Uyghur language functioned as a kind of code that allowed people to speak fairly freely without immediate repercussion. And so they had to develop tools to assess Uyghur speech. That was the first thing. There's 1,400 tech firms that are working in this space. In the last 2 years, $7.2 billion have been invested. And this is continuing to rise going forward. Some of the tools that have been developed are the ones that you see pictured here. One of them is an auto recovery scan and analysis tool that will plug into your phone or your computer and recover things that you've tried to delete from your hard drive. This happens in a matter of minutes, and it's done on a very wide basis. And the internal police documents I've reviewed, I saw in the space of a week that 2,000 or 3,000 scans had happened in one neighborhood in Urumqi. So this is happening quite widely. Another thing that they're trying to do is automate the transcription and translation of Uyghur audio, Uyghur speech, into Chinese so that they can assess it for what they think of as extremist content. Another thing is the automated assessment of people's faces based on their physiognomy to determine if the person is a Uyghur or Han or a foreigner, or in more recent cases, African, because they're now developing these tools in Africa. If you go to the region, as I did most recently in 2018, you'll see these people's convenience police stations, which are every 200 meters throughout the Uyghur majority areas. There's thousands of them. These are really data hubs. They're surveillance stations where there's camera systems that are face recognition enabled, and also the kind of home base for regular patrols, where people are apprehended as they walk down the street, asked to produce their phone and their ID, and their phone is scanned, their ID is checked. And it's almost exclusively young Uyghur men and women that are checked by the police. There's thousands of biometric checkpoints throughout the region. So if you enter an institution like a bank or a shopping mall or a school, or you travel across an institutional boundary like a county line, you'll go through a checkpoint where you have your face scanned and it's matched to your ID. And this is one of the checkpoints I went through when I was there in 2018. Most of these checkpoints have at least two lines. One of them is what they call a green lane, which is for people that appear Han based on their facial appearance. The police officer simply waves people that look Han into the Han line, and the Uyghurs, and they're just ushered through without having any ID check or face scan, while the Uyghurs are checked. All of this is supported by an unprecedented biodata collection program called Physicals for All. It's really one of the first times that an entire population of people, in this case 36 million, have submitted DNA, blood samples, fingerprints, and then also voice signatures. You had to speak into a microphone, reading the same thing several times, and so they get a unique voice signature for each person. And then they do a face scan of many people, which it means having thousands of pictures of your face taken from all angles. So they have a composite image of your face. It's a face print, actually. So as you move through space, the cameras can detect that it's you, even if your face is partially obscured. In other cases, it wasn't a face scan, but instead an iris scan. But in all cases, there's really significant numbers of amounts of data that's collected. In addition to this, they've also sent over 1 million government workers into people's homes to assess people in a sort of one-to-one basis, sort of human surveillance, and in many cases to write profiles for them that goes into a larger system. So that there's a biography for each person that's associated with all of this data. In spring 2017 is really when we saw the camp system actually being built and people being sent to the camp. And this was when they began an assessment of people to determine if they were safe, normal, or unsafe, or it could be translated as trustworthy or untrustworthy. In some cases, the metrics that were used were the ones that are listed here. So you start with 100 points, and for each that apply to you, you're deducted 10 points. So if you're of military age, minus 10. If you're Uyghur, minus 10. If you're unemployed, which is a majority really of the Uyghur population, minus 10. And then there's questions about travel, possessing a passport. Have you visited one of 26 banned or flagged countries, which is Muslim majority countries? Have you overstayed a visa while traveling abroad? Do you have a family member abroad? Those are all reasons to have a deduction of minus 10. And then there's questions about your religious practice. Do you pray daily? Do you have unauthorized religious knowledge? And remember I was saying that everyone was using WeChat to listen to messages, to be part of a Quran study group in the past. And so this applied to a vast majority of people. And they actually had tools to go back through people's social media history and figure out if people had been part of those things. Then the number 10 is about, do you teach your children about Islam in your home? So through this process, many, many people were sent to prison. In the last 2 years, over 500,000 Uyghurs, most likely people in Xinjiang, have been sent to prison, which is a significant proportion of those that were given criminal convictions across the country. Even though Uyghurs themselves only represent 1% of the entire Chinese population, they represent a huge number of those that are actually given criminal convictions. Others, though, were sent to the camps, and Nuri's already talked about some of them. This is one of the big ones that's next to Urumqi. It's since expanded, and it could hold an estimated 130,000 people, which makes it the largest prison in the world. These are not schools, even though the state has now begun to talk about them as schools. The equipment that is purchased according to government contracts is weaponized prison-style tools. So it's surveillance systems, razor wire, stun guns, handcuffs, spike clubs, all of those sorts of things. These are not normal schools. They're typically run as a sort of medium security prison, meaning that people are held in the same room rather than in isolation. Once they actually arrive in the camp from a detention center, which is where they're first interrogated and often tortured, in the camp space there's often kind of dormitories. It's run like a boot camp as well, so there's kind of a military drill aspect to it, where you wake up at 6 a.m., at least in some cases, make your bed, go out and raise the Chinese flag, sing the national anthem, sing red songs, learn from the thought of Xi Jinping, and then you begin to learn Chinese language and also more ideology training. In many cases, people are asked to stand and denounce their past religious practice, and to apologize, and others are meant to criticize them. And in no case are people supposed to speak Uyghur. Instead, this is a Chinese medium, Chinese language space in its entirety. You can be punished for speaking Uyghur in this space. In 2018, we began to see people transferred, in some cases, from detention centers to other camps. It's unclear as to exactly why they're all being transferred. There's significant forms of overcrowding in many of these camps, especially in the south, in Hotan and Kashgar. And so we saw these men being taken from Kashgar to Korla, which is another city in the region. We've been able to geolocate and verify the time that this happened. This happened in 2018. These detainees, are, as they appear here, with their blindfolds on and their hands handcuffed behind them. Part of this population transfer likely had something to do with the building of factories in association with the camp. So in many of the camp spaces, there's now factories either inside the interior of the camp or directly adjacent to it. And we began to see people being transferred from the camp space into those factory spaces. That looked like this, and mostly focused on textile manufacturing, textiles and garments. As has been mentioned a couple times, this is the space, 84% of Chinese cotton, a third of the world's cotton. And so it makes a lot of sense that you'd want to focus your garment industry here. It also has something to do with rising labor costs in eastern China, places like Shenzhen. So there's also garment manufacturing, Chinese garment manufacturing, going to places like Vietnam and Bangladesh, and now it's going to Xinjiang. So the Uyghur space is now becoming a forced or coerced labor space that's artificially lower in terms of labor cost. Most of the retailers that we buy things from here in the US, if it's cotton and says made in China, are implicated in this. All of these companies have been documented to receive either cotton in terms of the sourcing or in the production. I'll begin to sort of wrap up here because I'm running out of time, but this by telling you a story of one person who was transferred from a camp to work in a factory. She was taken to the camp because she had lived in Kazakhstan. She's Kazakh herself, and she had watched the Turkish TV shows on her phone where people were wearing hijabs. She talks to a great deal about how horrific her camp experience was, and she thought after she was transferred from the camp that things would get better, and they did to some extent. But after 2 days of being released from the camp, she was assigned to work in a factory by the local officials in her village. And the factory where she was taken to was near this space. This is the dormitory where she was held at night, so she was never free to go back to her normal life as she had lived before. She said if she tried to leave this space, her ID card would ring. So here you can see that because there's a checkpoint. So you could see that the surveillance system is part of what's holding people in place. This was her manager at the glove factory. Initially, she was told she would be getting 600 yuan, which is around $100 per month, because she was an intern and had to learn the skills. But then they slashed her monthly salary to 300 yuan, which is $50, and they said they would pay her 1.50 penny for every pair of gloves that she manufactured. In this video, which is part of it's a state TV video, the manager says that in the last year, they made $6 million in sales. So they're making a lot of profit while not paying these workers very much at all. And these are some of the gloves that they're selling, mostly in Eastern Europe and Russia. I'm going to speed through some of this, but it was on my list of things that I should talk about. But one of the things that's happened through the factory work is there's family separation. So the children are being taken from the parents as they work in the factories or as they're in camps. And we see a dramatic spike in these kindness centers, is how they're referred to in Chinese, where Uyghurs are trained in these spaces. Around 60 to 70% of all Uyghur children, at least in Hotan Prefecture, are now in some form of nurseries. This is what the nursery schools look like. It goes from 0 to 5 in nursery school, and then from there you move on to a boarding school for elementary school. So the very young children are taken. What's being produced by this is a form of systematic unfreedom. It's a weakening of the last institutions of Uyghur life, their faith, their language, their family, which is why we have to think about this as a kind of cultural genocide. It's eliminating signs of native Uyghurness, or what they call Yellik in Uyghur. Part of the thing that they're doing is they're removing cultural leaders. So over 400 have been taken. They're halting Uyghur language education, halting Uyghur language publications. They're demolishing thousands of Uyghur mosques, and demolishing and desecrating thousands of cemeteries. So in doing that, this is really the core of what, being rooted in place is your cemetery, your family grave, and they're just taking these away. And many times the family can't actually recover the remains because they're in the camp or the factory. From the state's perspective, what's being produced is a kind of permanent stability. The camps are becoming what they call a carrier of the economy, so they're now being productive. At first they were a real drain on the economy, but now there's all these factories can make a lot of money in this space, so it's a source of cheap labor. And they're also developing all these new technologies that are being exported to other places, already in Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Darren. Last but not least, I would like to introduce Jessica Batke. She is a China Files senior editor and an expert on China's domestic, political, and social affairs, and served as the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research Analyst for nearly 8 years before joining China File. In 2016, she was a visiting academic fellow at the Mercator Institute for China Studies in Berlin, where she published papers on Chinese leadership politics and created databases of hard-to-find, high-level Chinese policy documents and details about policy advisory groups. She is also proficient in Mandarin, and I look forward to hearing her talk as well. Thank you.
I'm here to talk about how this crisis intersects with China's foreign relations and foreign policy. I'm going to approach this question from a couple of angles. First, how individual states and multilateral institutions are dealing with this question. Secondly, what this crisis can tell us about what we should expect about China's global footprint and influence going forward in time. And what are things that people have done in response to this crisis, states have done, and what are potential measures people might take. So first, let's look at the responses of states and international institutions. I like to think of this all as being on a spectrum. And on the left side, kind of furthest from what Beijing would like to see, is public condemnation. And I don't list the US as the example because I think that everything they have done has been perfectly strategic. But they are, as Nuri said, one of the best examples of public-facing action on this. So the US has been really forward in terms of public statements and condemning publicly what China's doing. Kind of still on the side that China would not prefer, but a little bit more quiet and less confrontational, is maybe some countries who are doing private negotiation or just making limited asks about what China might be able to do. And a good example of this is Kazakhstan. So last year, They had some high-level consular dialogues with China and managed to get Kazakh citizens or ethnic Kazakhs released. And actually 2,000 ethnic Kazakhs were allowed to go to Kazakhstan and get citizenship, which is quite a feat. But they have not released a lot of public statements condemning what's happening. Now we get to what I like to call willful ignorance. This is a picture of Pakistani Foreign Minister Imran Khan as he gave an interview earlier this year to the Financial Times, saying that he did not know what was going on with the camps, even though there have been protests by Pakistani men whose wives are detained in them. And finally, people offering statements saying that China has a right to do whatever it does and it's helping its citizens. This is the Saudi Crown Prince earlier this year with Xi Jinping. But it's important to know that states' responses will change, and they don't always, they're not always in the same place on the spectrum, right? So somebody could be condemnatory one day and conciliatory the next. And I think a really good example of this is Turkey. They hadn't really said much. Turkey really hadn't said very much about what was going on until earlier this year, when it was rumored that a famous Uyghur musician and poet had died in one of the camps. And at that point, the foreign ministry issued a really, strongly worded statement calling it an embarrassment for humanity. And at that point, China swung into action and took a number of publicly visible steps in response. And I say publicly visible because I only assume that they did more things that I can't see. I only can see what I can see. So we know that they issued a travel warning for its citizens traveling to Turkey. They closed their consulate in the city of Izmir, and they arrested 4 Turkish businessmen in China on tax evasion charges. And what do you know, pretty soon afterwards, Turkey changed its mind and said that this should not affect its relations with China. So Turkey's not the only example of this. We've seen other states kind of go back and forth with how they want to respond to what's going on. Malaysia in particular has kind of said some things, then backed away, and then recently an MP spoke about it in Parliament again. Qatar had previously been very supportive and then kind of asked to unsign a letter it had been signed onto. So that's just something to keep an eye on and keep in mind that states will change their responses. So looking at international bodies, there's been a range of responses to this. I'm just going to hit a couple of the highlights. It varies just as much as state-to-state responses do, right? So you get some that are publicly condemnatory. This is a UN body, the Committee on Elimination for Racial Discrimination. Last year they issued a reasonably strongly worded statement kind of condemning what was going on in the camps. On the other end of the spectrum, you have the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which in March of this year issued a statement more or less supporting what China was doing. And this goes back to what was said earlier. It's pretty striking that a number of the statements of support have been from Muslim majority countries. And then within the UN system itself, there's been kind of a dueling joint statement, joint letter thing going on. So starting in July of this year, there was a joint letter to the Human Rights Council. And you can see the 22 signatories here. It strongly condemned what was going on in the Uyghur region and asked China to stop. And a couple days later, there was another letter to the same body with 37 signatories. And you, again, just take a look at the 2 lists there, and it's really striking who's on each list. And then there was a rematch for this in October, just a couple weeks ago. There was a statement the UK delivered condemning what was going on. Again, here are the backers. They've changed somewhat. Albania joined this time. The US joined this time. Switzerland, I don't know why, decided not to. China was better prepared this time. And the same day, there was a statement supporting China's remarkable achievements in the field of human rights, which had 54 backers, not all of which are public, but you can kind of guess who they are based on the sample list here. And I guess I should say, I can't say for sure that China organized this response, but I'm just guessing. So now that we've kind of seen what the range of responses have been, the question remains, why has the response generally been so slow, right? This has been happening for a couple of years. And why is it kind of muted? Why are not a lot of countries speaking out? I think there's a couple of reasons for this. The first one is that China did a really good job of hiding what was going on for a very long time, especially given information technology that we have available to us today, right? So you just heard about all these camps. Those started in early 2017. The first Radio Free Asia report about this was in September of 2017, right? So that's a number of months. before these were being really publicly reported, and that was very effective in kind of slowing the response. Second is that China is willing to pull out all the stops on this issue to get people to toe its line, right? Economic, diplomatic, and even people-to-people. This is something obviously China does beyond what's going on in the Uyghur region, but on an issue that they consider so existentially threatening, they're really, really willing to use whatever levers they have to get the international community on board with what they want said internationally. And you can see this with the Turkey example that we talked about earlier. And in this, they have a really powerful tool in the form of the Belt and Road Initiative, also, which has been discussed, right? They can use the carrot and stick of either offering or threatening to take away trade, infrastructure, and other kinds of investments that countries may want or need. And as we've seen earlier, China's pretty savvy at how it does this, right? So it can either pick off countries one by one, again, like Turkey, or it can kind of rally the troops and get people to sign these joint letters and joint statements and create this sort of united front. Third, there's a bunch of different things going on in these countries, and there may be countervailing corporate or individual interests, right? So if you have a company that's doing business in China, you may not want this brought up, and you may lobby your government for that. So it's just important to remember that each of these countries has a really complex environment of its own. It's hard to generalize why any set of actors in the country might support this or not support it. And also, some of these countries may have some human rights issues of their own and may not want to have this conversation internationally. Finally, I think, this is mentioned a couple times today, I think this is all made worse by chaotic US leadership internationally, and this is both on human rights but just generally. The US has not been particularly consistent, hasn't always been signing on to these letters, and I think that it's pretty clear that while internally there may be some members of this administration that are really supportive, it's not super clear that the person at the very top cares all that much, and that's really problematic if you're trying to build an international coalition. And of course, the trade war makes it really, really easy to frame any US response to this as being tied really cynically to the trade war rather than just being based on a principled human rights stance. Okay. So what can this tell us about the CCP abroad and what we should be looking for in terms of its global influence going forward? First of all, to be really clear, I think we should just care about this issue because we should just care about this issue. It's a crime against humanity what is happening, and it shouldn't matter whether or not it's affecting the world or not. But it is affecting the world, and as it's already been said, China is surveilling, intimidating, and coercing people that live here. Both people that live here and both that are citizens. And I think that should be deeply disturbing to anyone, that if this continues unabated, we're possibly heading for a future where US citizens cannot count on free speech because they're being surveilled and intimidated and harassed here in their home country. But also, I think this crisis has shown that has really laid bare institutional censorship that's been happening for a really long time that hasn't necessarily been as obvious. And here I've picked on poor Volkswagen chief executive. This is him earlier this year telling the BBC that he is not aware of the detention camps despite the fact that they employ hundreds of people at a production plant there. It's impossible to believe that he did not know this. And this, obviously this is very similar to what happened recently with Hong Kong and the NBA. I'm sure you guys are all aware of that. And I think what this really shows is that the CCP is now expanding outward the sort of propaganda and censorship regime that it's been enacting in China since forever. And that is not just that it's content to put its message out there and hope that people pick it up, but that it is now trying to enforce that message and enforce censorship of any other messages worldwide. And that should be really, really concerning to everybody. And it's even more disturbing that in the case of the Uyghur region, it means that entities that are benefiting from free speech in their own countries are choosing voluntary self-censorship in the face of crimes against humanity. China's also providing the hardware and software of these repressive tools to other countries, right? It's providing a template. How do you do this? What logistical resources are needed? What human resources are needed? What sort of technology do you need? And people have suggested that what's going on in Kashmir, where the internet was cut off, is directly taken from what China did in the Uyghur region in 2009 after the riots. And beyond that, not just the software, not just a model, not just a template, we know that they are selling a lot of this actual technical equipment, as Darren just mentioned. These are just the places where Huawei is selling AI surveillance technology to countries in Africa, but we know that it's much more expansive than that. So what are the options then, both at the state level and at the individual and community level to respond to this? And I'll say that the most, here we go. Nuri went over some of these, so, there we go. Nuri went over some of these, so I won't go into really great detail. These are all examples from the US because that's the system I know the best, but broadly, any country could enact this set of responses, one of which is sanctions. We have something called the Global Magnitsky Act, which is designed specifically to sanction people and entities involved in human rights violations internationally. We have chosen not to implement that as yet. But other countries have similar acts and could also choose to enact them against what's happening in the Uyghur region. Short of that, though, there are other things that one might do. Visa bans, targeted visa restrictions that the US has done, and creating of entities lists. So, we just put all those companies on this list, and that blocks US companies from dealing with them. Countries can pass domestic laws. Again, as already mentioned, these laws would provide protections for Uyghurs and others living in the US to help them stop being harassed and surveilled. It also mandates monitoring by someone at the State Department of what's going on in the Uyghur region, among other things. States can also, attempt to protect against forced labor. We recently, Customs and Border Patrol, is that what it's called? Recently issued a withhold release order, meaning that anything that comes from a particular country listed on, or company listed on this order is not allowed into the US because they determined that this was made with forced labor. Countries can also create watch lists of different companies that have been determined to be making things with forced labor. So it doesn't allow businesses to say they don't know and they can't do due diligence. Also, I think it's really important, as we've seen with the joint statements and the joint letters, to be heavily involved in multilateral coordination. What about you in this room? So I think that what I've seen, the most effective things I've seen fall into a couple of buckets, and a lot of them have to do with making use of the same leverage pressure points that China likes to make when it's trying to get people to be quiet abroad. And one of those is economic, right? We've seen already that economic boycotts against companies have been effective. As Marie mentioned, Cotton On and Target Australia have stopped taking cotton from China because they say they can't verify the supply chain. Costco got rid of a bunch of products that it had that were made with cotton from Xinjiang. And Muji apparently likes to use this as its ad, a selling point, that their cotton is from Xinjiang. So there's lots of room here to think about, how can we diminish the use of cotton from China in the supply chain. People have also looked into passive investments like pension funds. The California State Teachers Retirement System and the New York State Teachers Retirement System both invest in Hikvision, which is one of the major technology companies implicated here. And MIT, and I'm sure many other institutions have research partnerships with some of the companies that are implicated here. And so these are all things that people can look into and discover, are these research collaborations and are these passive investments part of my community, part of my school? In general, just doing academic research on this and doing more media reporting is helpful because it helps people understand what's going on and gives them tools to investigate their own community and see how they're involved. Secondly is reputational. So I know that it can be hard to see change, but China does care what people say about it. If it didn't, it wouldn't have changed their narrative from no, these camps don't exist to, well, maybe they exist, to, no, they're really great. Everybody's really happy. They did that because of international pressure, and they did that because of reputational costs. I think that's important to keep in mind. And I think back to the 2008 Olympics, and a lot of people put a lot of effort and time into tying those Olympics to Tibet and to South Sudan. So I wonder if there's going to be a similar movement related to the 2022 Olympics and Xinjiang. And finally, we talked about what the U.S. government is doing, and you guys can all get involved with that if you want to call your local representatives and let them know what you think about any of the bills currently being debated. That's all. Thanks.
So thank you to all of you for those wonderfully stimulating talks that all covered different ground. And I have to confess here that before this panel, I sent them all very detailed directives, and I can see that checklists basically, and you all did an amazing job of covering those very, very long checklists in the very little time that I gave you. And so I thank you very much for being mindful of that and covering so much ground here. So as I said, the way we will conduct the Q&A is as a moderated Q&A where we take a few questions that we think will be most productive here for the conversation. And Mohsen and Tim, have you already started collecting questions or? Okay, so while they are getting started with collecting questions, I mean, if any of you have questions that you would like to pass up, I will exercise moderator's prerogative of maybe get the ball rolling here. And please, feel free to pass up your questions to Mohsen and Tim. So I have a number of questions, and I'm not really quite sure where to begin, but let me start with this one, which was actually, if you could give it to them, that would be great. Which is that one thing that did not come up, and I think I know why. It didn't come up at all in any of your talks, and it is sort of a black hole in terms of my own understanding. Is what about the Chinese sort of domestic response, the Chinese citizens' response to this? Obviously, we know that there are intersections with the protests in Hong Kong, with other types of repressive actions that the Chinese state has taken against other ethnic minorities. Perhaps there is a response, we're not seeing it, or is there just no scope for response? And I'm happy for any of you or all of you to address this.
I'm happy to speak to that. So I did a small ethnographic study when I was there last in 2018, interviewing a number of Han folks that were living in the region. I found that there's a range of perspectives. So those that live in the region and have for a long time, that refer to themselves as local Xinjiang people, Bendiren in Chinese. Okay. Hello. Yeah. So the Bendiren, these local people, they think that this is a major overreach, and they're very concerned that at some point, like if they let the Uyghurs out, they say that there will be a major increase in violence and tension because so many Uyghur lives have been shattered and damaged by these processes, and they're also just deeply troubled by it because many of them grew up around Uyghurs. They identify with Uyghur food as a part of their identity. And so to see Uyghurs punished in this way for simply being Uyghur in most cases, many cases, is really problematic and troubling for them. There's others though that have come more recently to the region, and they really see this as something that was necessary because the Xinjiang problem, the Uyghur problem is long-standing, and the government had to stand up and do something. And so they see that this is the government protecting them, protecting their interests. So some Han people that I spoke to, especially people that are working as what they call older brothers and sisters in Uyghur homes, they saw this as really protecting them, especially the surveillance system, the camp system, the threat of that. It is extending kind of their power so that they could go into Uyghur neighborhoods, Uyghur homes, and not feel any sense of threat. Whereas in the past, they would have felt that they were entering a space that wasn't their own. So they see this as China acting in a very powerful way, protecting them. They also think that the technology is cutting edge and really showing to the world that China is a powerful country. So those are the two really ranges. Most people, though, outside of the region, they don't really understand what the situation is. They maybe have heard about camps or schools, and they know, like, they think maybe Uyghurs are bad. That's like the typical sort of stereotype about Uyghurs everywhere in the country among Han people. But they don't know what it looks like on the ground. They don't know that families are being torn apart. The state media doesn't report that. They just say that this is poverty alleviation, this is vocational training, and this is a benefit for them. If they do care or have an opinion, they might say that this is our taxpayer dollars supporting, Uyghur re-education, and so like they would see this as like, a gift that they're giving to these Uyghurs far afield in Xinjiang. So that's sort of the range of it. Most people really don't have a strong opinion.
Can I make an addition?
Absolutely.
There are two problems with not being able to know what the Chinese people in general stands on this issue. One is the Chinese government has been very effective, particularly in the last 2 decades, to create this anxiety that the Uyghur people are a public enemy. The way that the Uyghur people just go about with their life, in of itself is a problem for even ordinary Chinese people. There was a social, racial discrimination over the years, but this turned into kind of a racist way of seeing the Uyghurs as general. And then two, China is not a free society. The people have no say. Even if those reasonable ones wanted to speak out, they have no voice in this, other than these officials being cited in today's New York Times article. In one instance, one Chinese official in the city of county of Yarkand released close to 7,000 people, and he ended up getting punished. And there's some others in academia actually cherish this policy. Is what's happening. I can name names, I don't want to bore you, where there's several individuals who've been in the news a lot. They have been promoting actually what's called Xinjiang, final solution to the Xinjiang problem. 解决新疆问题的最终方法. That's the exact term that they've been using to advocate the current policies. So it's a mixed bag. I like to believe that they care, but it's hard to predict what they really stand on.
Okay. Should I keep exercising moderator's prerogative, or? Yes, absolutely. Okay, so I will actually, and this is a very good question that I will combine with one of my own. The question here is, to what degree has the Chinese government appropriated Islamophobic discourses produced in the West in framing their suppression as a war on terrorists? And, the question that I would add to that is I find it remarkable how many Muslim countries, majority of Muslim countries, are buying into essentially this global Islamophobic discourse. And I can of course expect and predict some of the reasons for that, but I'd love to hear all of you expand on that a little bit more.
I think Nuri addressed this pretty clearly at the beginning, that China really jumped on top of the opportunity to reframe the problem in terms of terrorism the moment the 9/11 happened. I mean, it was really almost instantaneous. Maybe a month afterwards, they started putting out these statements, like at the UN and stuff, about how it was terrorism, and always before it had been separatism and splitism. So it really had not been a part of the national discourse until that time. And so it really did take advantage of what the US was doing, and very cannily saw that this was an opportunity to reframe its own problem. And as we said before, I'm not an expert on any of these countries at all, so I don't want to make generally sweeping statements about why they may or may not be buying into this. But I don't know that they're buying into it so much as deciding how to prioritize what they need and putting perhaps material economic interests ahead of some more abstract support for religious brethren.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you go to a Global Times, that's a Chinese tabloid, you Google Chinese export of surveillance technology, you will find an interesting editorial which specifically suggests
with a clear term actually. While the West, led by the United States, bombing Muslims, we helping Muslim people to build schools and hospitals and roads. And they're actually promoting the surveillance techniques that they have been tested out, partially in inland China, implemented, expanded now. New York Times reported there are about 18 countries, including Germany, are in the process of adopting Chinese technology. So it could be economic, it could be technology, it could be diplomatic, but what Muslim countries, the societies don't understand, or failing to understand, or feigning ignorance, is the fact that the Chinese call their religion, the Muslim faith, as mental illness. While all of this is happening, the Saudi prince, who's groomed to be the custodian of two holiest mosques in Islam, when it goes to China, and his name is banned, his way of greeting people is banned, and he didn't even bother to ask what's wrong with my religion when he talked to Xi Jinping.
I can add this a little bit. So in reading the Chinese language policing theory that's out there.
For the recording purposes, I just need all of you to speak into that as clearly as possible. Thank you.
So in reading the Chinese language literature on counterterrorism policing, you can see that already in 2007 they were reading the Petraeus Doctrine, which is the counterinsurgency field manual that was used in Iraq, where they're talking about full spectrum intelligence, disintegrating or fragmenting social networks, targeted assassinations and rendition, all those things, and then winning the hearts and minds of the population. And so that was already part of the policing discourse in China back in around 2009. Then, since then, in the West, we've developed what we call CVE, countering violent extremism, and that's also something that's been picked up in China, and they see themselves as implementing this, but they say with Chinese characteristics. So they're drawing on the socialist past, the sort of labor camp apparatuses that they used in the past in China, and adding kind of a scale element to what has been done in other places.
Diplomatically, they're also doing something so successfully. One, they successfully and effectively convinced Muslim countries that the United States is creating this problem in order to hamper China rights. As it has been said about Hong Kong, why would the United States create this problem? And some Muslim countries using this, because China has presented itself as a kind of soft power against the United States, helping on the Uyghur issue is almost in a way to helping the United States against China. So there's a lot of geopolitical aspect to it, and China's have been very effective in buying out their silence and misstating an obvious fact.
Jessica, did you?
I was just going to say that as an example of what Mary's talking about, there was an Albanian reporter who went to the Uyghur region a month or two ago, and he was on one of these state-led tours, and he went specifically because he thought that U.S. and Western media was lying or exaggerating about what was happening in the Uyghur region. He went there to see for himself that it was incorrect, and he came away basically saying, I realize that everything I've been shown here by the Chinese government, by the propaganda apparatus is a lie, and that these people are scared and terrified and not allowed to practice their religion, which is pretty powerful because he went there specifically to, say that the U.S. is wrong or the West is wrong about this, and came away with the opposite impression.
So thank you. Okay, I think what one of the students did is very helpfully sort these questions into type, and so I'm going to. I think we have time for sort of 2 or 3 more questions, if you don't mind, and if you all don't mind, I would like to, give sort of. Allow the audience to have a voice here as well. So I'm combining a number of questions here about Han Chinese nationals. There are 3 or 4 about them, and I'll just ask one of them because they are overlapping. So the question is this: as a Han Chinese national, I find Uyghur sympathizers among the Han Chinese, myself being one. It's very hard for us to organize and show our sympathy towards the Uyghur community. On the one hand, it's hard to fight against the general anti-Muslim sentiment on Chinese social media. On the other hand, there exists a political apathy, and can't read that, but I think generally it's just political apathy. And so, I mean, I think the question here is, what should Uyghur sympathizers among Han do for the Uyghur people, especially given the totalitarian regime in China? Sorry, that is a really tough question, but I think a really important one. I think it's a very important question.
Yeah, it's a very important question, and it's great to hear that there's that interest. It's difficult to say. It's difficult to know how to organize. One of the things I've been doing with folks like this question asker is we've been translating English language and other texts and documents that really show what's happening on the ground using empirical evidence into Chinese, and we're working to publish them in places like Taiwan and Hong Kong, and also like using various methods on Weibo and Weixin in China. But of course, those things are going to be taken down immediately in China, so it's not very effective really to get the news to people in China. But I said, beyond sort of that approach, the moving discourse, I think you can also work with your friendship networks. You can tell people that you know what you've heard or what you think about the situation there, and create more solidarity that way. It's not enough, but that's, I guess, one place to start.
Couple of things to consider. One is how this is going to go down as part of the Chinese history. We today, in 2019, still talk about the Holocaust, something done by Nazi Germany. And German people have to deal with this every day. So a good question to ask yourself, what kind of future that you want for your country, the next generation. It's quite simple. And I'm really delighted that some Chinese officials start coming out, providing the documents that we saw on the paper today, as well as this individual gave interview to ITV documentary stating that we fooled these people into the camps with the lies that we're going to educate them. Now what we need is a mental hospital. Otherwise they will be a problem to the society. And then the second thing is quite simple, learn the truth. And Uyghurs are not the enemy. The Chinese government created an enemy with the Uyghurs. And the fact that the Chinese say something 3 times does not make it true.
Okay, so again, I mean, there's so many questions about how people can help, and here's another one that I think is a very good one, framed in terms of Hollywood, from whence much Islamophobia emanates. So, the question is, one effective method of putting pressure on the Chinese government is through Hollywood and the entertainment industry. Has there been any documentary made that you know of, or have you been approached by Hollywood to highlight what's going on there?
No one directly approached from this part of the country, but Frontline recently did an amazing documentary that you should take a look at. It focuses on artificial intelligence, benefits and harm to our lives, the government system, democratic values. It highlights the Uyghur struggle by saying the technology is supposed to foster our lives, advance human rights, but the authoritarian regime's been benefiting more than a democratic nations of this particular technology. So it talks briefly about what's happening, but the only documentary that I know made in the United States, other than the evening longer news pieces, the Cash Production, a UK-based documentary company, did an hour-long documentary which has been taken down that they have republication concerns in the United States. But and also one other problem that we've been told by producers is that the camera crew, investigative journalists' inability to access to the region. So the CNN reporters and others have been beaten up by the Chinese, and they're recording equipment's been damaged and confiscated. So there's a real challenge. If you wanted to make a documentary, you need to get access to the actual facilities that the Chinese will not be able to show or willing to show.
Yeah.
I was just going to add systematically, and I'm sure a lot of you are aware of this because of the recent South Park episode, but Hollywood does not have a long and glorious history of producing things that might not go down well in China. Whether or not they think they're going to show that exact film in China doesn't really matter because they have other interests there, right? And so we've seen this over and over again. One of my favorite examples is Red Dawn, where they shot the whole thing with the Chinese soldiers as the enemy, and then in post-production they changed all the uniforms to North Korea. So I just think that that's really important to keep in mind too. That that may not be causing the silence so far, but it's hard to ignore the fact that the Chinese government has been pretty successful in getting some Hollywood companies or producers to kind of pre-censor themselves so that they can ensure that their products have ready access to the Chinese market.
No, thank you. That's great. And if I could just ask one final question, and I think this may fall in Jessica's court, but anyone's free to answer it. I mean, you have talked, and I think very meaningfully, about how the U.S. has taken some leadership in opposing what's going on and in trying to apply effective counteraction. But do you see a scenario where a comprehensive U.S.-China trade deal might result in the U.S. withdrawing public condemnation? Not to end on a very bad note, but...
I really hope not, I would say first. I would say there is really strong support in the administration, again, not the apex, but there are a number of people in this administration that honestly really, truly care about this issue and this crisis. And I'd be very surprised if they didn't fight to keep this on the agenda. But that said, this president is so mercurial and so unpredictable, and so a lot of other words that I'm not going to say in public, that I don't want to venture a guess, but I do want to just leave a little bit of hope in there that there are people both in leadership and at the working level they're there every day that are working really hard to get this and keep this on the agenda.
I'd like to echo that sentiment expressed about our president. It's very difficult to figure out where he even stands on China as a country. So he changes his position all the time. I don't know, recently we've been advocating that actually trade talks should not include or involve the Uyghur crisis. Because at the end of the day, if something needs to be discussed, or concession needs to be made, this must be one of the issues that they look at, because this is it's such an important issue for the Chinese government. As Jessica pointed out, they care so much about how they're being perceived in the international community. This public scrutiny, the media coverage, this governmental public statements continues, they will be feeling cornered, and they need to start using Uyghur as a bargaining chip. This sentiment was actually expressed by Senator Rubio a couple of weeks ago in the congressional hearing. So I think it should be a separate issue. But on the positive side, the Uyghur issue has become such a big issue in the U.S.-China relations. I think it will be extremely difficult for somebody other than President to make a 180-degree U-turn. When you walk through the halls of Congress, at the White House and the State Department, you'll be amazed how much people care about this issue. The fact that the Deputy Secretary John Sullivan holding a public event on the sidelines of UN General Assembly, inviting over 30 countries and having 4 to co-sponsor, and the Assistant Secretary of State holding a press conference, citing what I pointed out earlier, and also all this substantive conversations taking place in the Congress today. There's one issue unifies both parties these days, and they agree on very little, except for the Uyghur issue. So there are a lot of positive things that we can talk about and feel good about. Look at it, in the last 2 years, Uyghurs from nothing to something today. Everybody talks about Uyghurs, especially in Washington. I think there should be a model, as Jessica pointed out, Australia, Canada, the Brussels and Berlin, everybody in Europe should also follow this, despite their relationship with President Trump.
That's great. Thank you. That's excellent.